Yeah, thank you very much for having me here and to share my limited knowledge, actually, I would say, on China's foreign policy and China as a global power with you. Actually, from the introduction of my background, you know that my research mainly focuses on China's domestic politics. But I have been teaching on Chinese foreign policy and China and the world for years. That's actually an interesting combination because I think this kind of combination of domestic politics and foreign policy allows us to see China from inside out. And we know that foreign policy actually is an extension of domestic politics. So we cannot understand Chinese foreign policy without a clear understanding of China's domestic politics and economy. And on the other hand, by looking at China's foreign policy, actually we can better understand China's domestic situations as well, because after all, China lives in a globalized world, and many of its domestic policies have to be made according to China's the global structure and China's relations with other countries, right? So it is from this perspective. I look at China's foreign policy and I'll share with you guys some of my thinking and understanding about China's foreign policy. Okay, so that's it for the first lecture. And here's a very brief overview of what's going to happen in the next 1 hour and 15 minutes. So first of all, I will discuss the driving forces of China's foreign policy. Okay, and what are the key players in Chinese foreign policy making? Okay, and next we will very briefly go through China's evolving foreign relations. But we know that actually there are a lot of foreign relations involving China and other countries. So I'm really stuffing a whole semester's courses into this 1 hour. I don't think I can get into much details, but I try to present you the big picture, or say the general picture about China's foreign relations. And in the end, and actually I will raise some question for you guys to discuss later on. Okay, that is, how do we assess the prospect of China's peaceful rise? Okay. All right. So first, about the driving forces of China's foreign policy. Well, for anyone who have taken some introductory courses on international relations, you know that there are generally 3 levels of analysis when we look at international relations. When we try to analyze what's going on in terms of international relations, there are 3 levels of explanatory factors. So first, the individual level, and the domestic or say state level, and the global level. Okay. So at the 3 levels of analysis, there are different factors that may affect a country's foreign policy making. So first of all, individual level. That is, we look at individual human beings' political attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. Normally, we pay more attention to the leaders, the political leaders of countries, right? Like when we think about the American foreign policy, definitely nowadays Donald Trump is a major player, and we all need to be very careful about what he can do and what the kind of impacts he may exert on the global system, right? Not just on America, but on the international system. But not only political leaders, some other individuals, like terrorists, like Osama bin Laden, may play a role, right? So this is the individual level. And then domestic or say state level, we look at the domestic attributes and decision-making bodies of countries. And actually for all countries in the world, the domestic institutions actually play a major role in foreign policy making, right? And lastly, there's the global level factors. That is other states and non-state global factors, like international organizations, right? Or international treaties, or the global power structure. They all affect countries' foreign policy making, right? Okay, so basically these are the 3 levels of analysis when we look at international relations. And when it comes to Chinese foreign policy making, actually we can also detect the different factors, the 3 levels that influence China's foreign policy. So let's start with the domestic level. I would regard these driving or these players as the major driving forces of Chinese foreign policy making. We know that I guess in the past few lectures, you have learned about China's political structure, right? China is a party state, okay, in the sense that there is the party, the Chinese Communist Party, and the Chinese government in charge of policy making. And when it comes to foreign policy making, it's the same, okay? So there are some key players in the political system that drives foreign policy making. So within the party, we know that the Politburo Standing Committee is the most powerful body inside the Chinese political system, okay? And the 7-member Standing Committee actually has the final say on essentially everything. However, we know that there are so many policy issues. The Politburo Standing Committee actually needs a lot of input from different fields, from people with different specialties, right? So in terms of foreign policy making, actually there is this small, the leading small group called Foreign Affairs / National Security Leading Small Group. This group is the most important body that is in charge of China's foreign policies. Okay, actually, there are two names for this group. Okay, Foreign Affairs leading small group and the National Security leading small group. There are two names, but it's essentially the same group of people. Okay, headed by the Chinese president. Now it's Xi Jinping, but it also involves other major players in the Chinese political system, like in foreign affairs, like people from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Commerce, or from the military. Okay, so this group actually would consider all major foreign policy issues and make final recommendations and approval on certain things. So that's within the party. And inside the government, we know that the State Council is the highest body of political, of decision making in the Chinese government. And within the State Council, the Foreign Ministry definitely is the most important player for foreign affairs. But it's not actually the only player. There are many other ministries, as I mentioned, the Ministry of Commerce, right? And other ministries, like Ministry of Public Security or State Security, they all play some roles inside the government system, okay? But definitely Foreign Ministry is delegated most of the power of foreign policy making, okay? And lastly, don't forget the army, okay? The People's Liberation Army actually also plays a very important role, especially in defense-related foreign affairs, okay? So I guess the Chinese, the Communist Party can never make major defense-related decisions without consulting the army, okay? So these are the key policy makers inside the political system. But we know that with the pluralization of the Chinese political system as well as the Chinese society, actually nowadays there are more and more players that can have some say to influence foreign policy making. So here we need to pay attention to the foreign policy actors on the margins, okay? So first of all, business sector. I think this is the same with many countries in the world, not just China. The business people, they always want to lobby the government and persuade the government to make certain policies for their own benefits, right? So in China, the business sector, like the state-owned enterprises or the export-oriented industries and some financial institutions, the banks, okay, they all want to have some say for China's foreign policies, of course, for their own benefits. For example, we know that there are more and more Chinese enterprises, mainly, mostly state-owned enterprises. They are going abroad to make investment, right? To facilitate their investment, of course, they want the Chinese government to make certain policies according to their needs and according to the situations in the host countries, right? And like the export-oriented industries, which are kind of competitive in a global market, of course they want China to join more and more trade treaties, right? So they are like a strong pushing force for China to join like the WTO. And also banks. When we talk about China's foreign overseas investment or the Chinese government's foreign aid, they all involve banks, right? For the money to flow overseas, of course, the banks, they play a major role in it, right? So these institutions are very important players influencing China's foreign policy making. And although the central government is the main decision maker, actually local governments in China, they are playing also important roles in implementing many policies. And actually some local governments, they also establish relations with foreign countries on their own as well. Especially like the border provinces. Like the province in the north, they may deal with Russia, right? Or in the northeast, they deal with the Koreans. And in the southeast part of China, they will deal with Southeast Asian countries. So this, especially now, under China's One Belt and One Road initiatives, more and more Chinese local governments, actually, they are dealing with neighboring countries, okay, mainly on trade and economic issues, okay. Actually, we'll talk more about the One Belt and One Road initiative later. And then research institutes and academia. We know that actually the Chinese government now is receiving policy inputs from all kind of sources, including research institutions. Like Alba Meda, the Chinese Foreign Affairs College, is quite famous for giving policy suggestions to the Chinese political leaders. Okay, so academics are often invited to give lectures on the Chinese political leaders to make suggestions for them. So there are many ways for the policymakers and the researchers to interact with each other and to receive input from these people. Okay, and lastly, media and the netizens. They are becoming more and more vocal in China, especially those kind of media with nationalistic opinions, like Global Times. Here's something you may want to pay attention to. Global Times is a very infamous newspaper in China that especially promotes strong nationalism. Okay, and you can often see a lot of opinions on China's foreign relations or foreign policies. And Chinese netizens, they are also becoming quite vocal on a lot of nationalistic issues like anti-Japanese protests, or whenever China gets into conflict with some other countries, the netizens, you will often see a lot of strong opinions from netizens. But we have to pay attention that these their opinions do not necessarily represent the general opinions of the Chinese population. Okay, so whatever their opinions oftentimes are biased. Okay. All right, so these are the domestic level driving forces of China's foreign policy. And next is the individual level driving forces. So when we look at Chinese politics, we can never ignore how much influence the individual Chinese leaders can exert. Well, so far China has seen 5 generations of political leadership. They all have their own personal style, okay? And their personal style more or less influences China's foreign policy styles. Okay, so the first generation, Mao Zedong, okay, who ruled China for nearly 3 decades. Well, if you look at his personality, you will find that he's quite China-centric. Okay, well, during his term in office, actually he only visited one country. Do you know which country is that? Soviet Union exactly. So he never visited any other countries. So that somehow reflected his China-centric style and somewhat an isolationist view about China's foreign relations. And the next generation, Deng Xiaoping, okay, he's the next strongman after Mao. And compared to Mao, he is more open, and this may have to do with his personal experiences. We know that when he was young, he studied and worked overseas in France, right? And actually, he is more interested in dealing with and learning from the Western countries. Okay, so when he came into power, China opened up to the Western world and tried to build up good relationship with the Western countries, despite their different ideologies from China. So that's the second generation. Now, the third generation, Jiang Zemin, he actually largely followed Deng Xiaoping's style, but with more kind of personal color, I would say. Actually, for those of you who paid attention to him in the past, he's actually a very colorful person. Okay, he likes to show off his foreign languages and dancing skills. Okay, and he sometimes Chinese citizens sometimes make fun of him. Okay, about his English or about his way of dealing with foreigners. But in any case, he follows this kind of open up mentality, and he is interested in maintaining good relations with other countries, especially the Western countries. Okay, and the next, Hu Jintao. Well, he is less colorful, but still he follows his predecessors in continuing to open China up and to build more friendly relations with countries in the world. Okay, and lastly, the current generation of leaders, Xi Jinping. Well, actually, many regard him as the third strongman in Chinese in the history of the PRC. Okay, after Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping, he actually has quite strong and assertive personal style. Okay, even before he came into power, his style actually showed up occasionally. For example, in 2009, when he visited Mexico, actually he had quite some inflammatory comments about some foreign countries who had nothing better to do than to judge China and to point fingers at China. He actually said that China, we don't export revolution, we don't export poverty or hunger, and we don't cause troubles. What else do you want? Why do you just judge us? Right? So that speech actually was regarded as too inflammatory, so it was censored inside China. But still, you can see his personal style from this kind of speech. And actually, the style shows up in China's recent foreign policy as well. We can see that China becomes more assertive, especially when it comes to conflicts with other countries. And in South China Sea, in particular, you can see China is becoming more aggressive or assertive in some sense. Okay, so these are the individual level factors. And lastly, at the global level, okay, actually China's behaviors or say its foreign policies to a large degree are shaped by the global structure. So for example, back during the Cold War period, China will either align with the Soviet Union or later the United States. Okay, so China was kind of captured in the struggle between the two powers, the two superpowers, right? So it had to take side. But later, after the Cold War ended and with the rise of globalization, China learned to embrace globalization and to participate in global trade and economic relations, build up economic relations with other countries in the world. And China also chose to join more and more international organizations. actually the membership in international organizations more or less has some binding power on China's behaviors. Okay, so China largely abide by the rules of the game and follow the regulations of international organizations. In that sense, China becomes more responsible on the international stage, rather much more than during the Maoist rule when China disregarded the rules of the game in the international system. And then when it comes to when we narrow down and look at the regional environment, actually the regional trade and economic relations within Asia or say Asia Pacific region also shapes China's behaviors. And China, we see that it's participating in regional organizations like ASEAN, like APEC, quite actively. So these regional organizations also kind of constrain China's behaviors and the foreign policies. Okay, and lastly, the behaviors and changes in other countries also affects China's foreign relations. For example, what Soviet Union did actually triggered kind of reaction, in fact, in China's attitudes towards the Soviet Union and the communist bloc early on, and later the collapse of Soviet Union also drove China to seek its own independent foreign policy. So you can see that. Can you all hear me clearly? Okay, good. All right. So here we have a kind of a brief survey about the major factors affecting China's foreign policy making. So next, let's take a look at China's evolving foreign relations. Okay. From this map, actually we can see so far China has established diplomatic relations with the vast majority of countries in the world. Okay, all the countries in green are have diplomatic ties with China, except a few red spots. Do you know why these countries do not have diplomatic relations with China?
Yeah, yeah.
Taiwan, yes, exactly. Because of the Taiwan issue, okay, one country can either recognize Taiwan, or say the Republic of China, or mainland China, the People's Republic of China, okay. So in the tug of war between Taiwan and mainland China, actually we can see mainland China wins. It establishes diplomatic relations with the vast majority of countries, just leaving more than 20 allies for Taiwan, okay. So even that China has to maintain foreign relations with so many countries, but China, of course, has to have some priorities, right? And indeed, it has. So there are essentially three priorities in China's foreign relations. One is the relations with major powers, okay, namely the US, the Europeans, and Russia. And next is neighboring countries, okay. And developing countries, or say the developing world, is also a major platform for China to, well, actually there's a lot for China to gain from this platform. Okay, let's look at China's relations with the three groups of countries one by one. So major powers. When we talk about major powers, of course, America comes first. Well, China, so far actually, has successfully established very integrative and tight economic ties with America. In what is termed as Chimerica, China actually has formed a kind of symbiotic relationship with the U.S. Okay, actually, the term Chimerica is coined by a history professor from Harvard University, Neil Ferguson. And does anyone know what Chimerica means?
China plus America.
Right, in what way? Economic, right? Okay, very good. How? Yes, through trade, right? And what else? Okay, so to put it simply, it's bilateral relations. Yes, we can regard this as China produces, America buys, China lands, U.S. borrows. Okay, so we know that China actually maintains a quite high trade surplus with the U.S. So it exports much more than it imports from the U.S. Okay, and as a result, China actually accumulates a lot of foreign reserves. Okay, and then with the foreign reserves, what does China do? It lends the money to the U.S. so that U.S. can buy more from China. Okay, in this sense, actually China benefits a lot from the bilateral trade with the U.S. Okay, but of course that also causes frictions between China and the U.S. And China is often criticized as manipulating its currency and dumping its products into the American market, etc. Okay, but nevertheless, China does buy a lot of national bonds from the U.S. That helps the U.S. sustain its financial stability to a certain degree. Okay, so that's on the economic ground. There actually is also strategic cooperation between the two countries on many issues. Well, back during the 1970s and 1980s, before the Soviet Union collapsed, actually the two countries collaborated closely to fight against the Soviet Union, okay, like in Afghanistan. The two countries actually collaborated quite closely. And later, China and the U.S. cooperates on various issues like terrorism, okay. After 9/11, the U.S. launched the war on terror, and China also has its own problems with the East Turkestan independence movement in Xinjiang, and that's kind of related, right? So China actually has a reason to support the U.S. war on terror, and the U.S. does collaborate with China on intelligence collection and some other ways, and on other issues like the North Korean nuclear issue. The U.S. definitely needs China's cooperation, and China also has incentive to work together with the U.S. to constrain North Korea's nuclear development, right? And similarly on Iran, okay. So actually the two countries, they do have a lot of grounds for strategic cooperation, okay. These are the forces that drive the two countries together. But we also have to realize that there is strong mutual distrust between the two countries. Okay, first of all, the two countries, they have very different ideologies. Okay, not in the sense that China still upholds communism or socialism, but because China maintains a strong party state, it's an authoritarian regime, and this runs against the U.S. belief in democracy and liberty. Okay. And the two countries, they also have very different political systems. And the U.S. always emphasizes on human rights, but China insists that sovereignty is the most important thing, and it always resists the U.S. Criticism on its human rights issues, right? So the two countries, they do have a lot of conflicts in this regard. And then Taiwan issue becomes a major hindrance between in the bilateral relations. We know that China has always wanted to unify the country by taking over Taiwan, right? But the U.S., with its Taiwan Relations Act, does have obligation to protect Taiwan from the Chinese aggression. So Taiwan issue, especially in the past several decades, was a major irritant in the bilateral relations. And also, lastly, the two countries, as the two most powerful countries in the world nowadays, they naturally have some kind of competition, right? The U.S., since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the U.S. is always looking for the next enemy. And China actually, for a while, appeared to be a very good candidate until terrorism rose up, right? So, although now the U.S. perhaps pays more attention to terrorism, but China still appears as a competitor for or a potential enemy to the U.S. in the global system. So the two countries, they do compete on many grounds. Okay, so we can see that China's relationship with the U.S. there are both driving forces driving them together and also driving them apart. And next, the Europeans. Well, China also maintains quite warm relationship with Europe to a large degree. Okay, just like China's relationship with America, economics comes first. So actually, China benefits a lot from the economic and trade relations with the European countries, with Britain, France, and Germany as the three most important European countries for China. Okay, so overall, actually, the EU is China's largest trading partner, and China is the EU's second largest trading partner, only after the US. So you can see how strong the economic ties are between the two sides. And actually, China also benefits a lot from the technical assistance from the European countries. Okay, compared to the US, the Europeans are actually more willing to sell more advanced technology to China. And actually, back into the 1970s, China actually imported a lot of advanced military technology and weapons from the European countries. And of course, that stopped after 1989 when the arms embargo was imposed on China. But this kind of tradition actually lasted. Okay, so yeah, essentially, the Europeans, they are more willing to sell more sensitive, high tech to China. Okay, when compared with the U.S. Well, actually, there's reason behind that. We know that China and the U.S. kind of compete with each other, right? And China is often perceived as a major threat to the U.S. But for European countries, they do not concern that much about the threat from China. Instead, they are more worried about the threat from where? Russia, right? Geopolitically, Russia is more dangerous to European countries as a threat than to China. So from the European perspective, China's rise does not pose that much security threat to European countries, right? So as a result, they are more willing to cooperate on military grounds with China. So that's why actually we see quite a lot of military exchanges between China and European countries like Britain, like France, like Germany. Okay. And politically, actually, there is also very structured political dialogue, like the China-EU summit, which was started in 1994. Okay, so that provides a kind of institutionalized platform for the two countries to come together and to discuss various political, economic, or security issues. And actually, this kind of structure was established much earlier than the dialogue between China and the US. We know that China and the US only since 2006 did they start to have this kind of serious bilateral dialogue. But for Europe, the China-EU summit started in 1994. Okay, that's more than a decade earlier. So we can see that the Europeans actually, they realized the importance of having this kind of structured political dialogue with China way earlier than Americans did. Okay, so that's Europe. Okay, next, Russia. Well, for those of you who know something about the Chinese history, we know that China actually went into deep split with the Soviet brother. Okay, so since the late 1950s till the breakdown of the Soviet Union, actually the Sino-Soviet relations went into a deep freeze. Okay, and the two countries even went into military skirmishes along the border areas. And for a while, China really worried about an invasion from the north, from the Soviets. Okay, so the relations between the two countries for a large period of the PRC history were not that good. Okay, but since the collapse of the Soviet Union, actually, the two countries tried to rebuild their trust. Okay, and of course, there's reason for that. At the end of Cold War, Russia is kind of encircled by the Western forces, right? It desperately needs ally. And China, after the 1989 Tiananmen Square incident, China also needed allies from around the world. So the two countries, they equally perceived the threat from the West and the need for allies. So that's one reason for the two countries to come together and to rebuild their relations. And of course, there are many other reasons for the two countries to become partners. Like especially nowadays when we consider the triangular relationship between China, US, and Russia, right? Both Russia and China actually they see the US as kind of a threat, right? So they do want to collaborate in certain ways to balance against the US. So the two countries actually since the 1990s did a lot to rebuild their trust. So one thing is to withdraw troops from the border. And we know that China and the Soviet Union actually had a lot of border disputes. And actually China in the mid-1990s made quite some compromise. It gave up a lot of disputed territories to the Russians, in exchange for a better relationship with Russia. That was done under Jiang Zemin's administration. And actually that's one reason why he is criticized and disliked by many Chinese citizens. But in any case, the relationship started to build up, and especially in recent years when Putin came into power. And Putin actually is a quite popular figure inside China, among Chinese citizens. He is perceived, we know that he is a former KGB agent, right? He is perceived as a kind of James Bond-like character, full of charisma, so Chinese citizens all love him. But in any case, the two countries, China and Russia, they do collaborate on many issues, especially energy and strategic fronts. We know that China buys a lot of weapons from Russia. Russia is by far the most important supplier of weapons to China's military modernization. And I guess India also buys a lot from Russia, right? So military cooperation is one thing, and energy. We know that China, since 1993, actually became a net importer of energy. So with its industrialization, China needs a lot of oil, natural gas to sustain its industrial production, right? But Russia, actually, on the other hand, is with a lot of supply of such things that China needs. So as we can see from this map, I'm not sure if you can see it clearly. So in the past decade, actually, a pipeline was built from Siberia to the northeast part of China. That allows China to import a lot of oil and natural gas from Russia. That seems actually a very natural choice, because in the past, Russia actually is now one of the world's major supplier of energy, mainly supplied to the West, to the European countries. But now, with an emerging market in the East, of course, Russia should snatch the opportunity, right, to open up new market. So for the Russians, of course, they have incentive to exploit the Chinese market. And for China, because in the past, its oil mainly comes from the Middle East, and that has to go a long way on the sea, right? And that actually causes quite some security problem. But now if we can have this oil transported through the pipeline on land, that actually can provide another route of transportation and perhaps a safer route, right? So for China, it also has very strong incentive to exploit the oil and gas supply from Russia. So on this ground, the two countries actually has strong reason to cooperate with each other. So we can see that by now China has built up rather strong and good relations with the major powers in the world. Okay, it's a rather successful success. And next, let's move to the neighboring countries. Okay. We know that during the Maoist period, actually China had some driven by the communist ideology. Actually, the Chinese Communist Party sponsored a lot of communist insurgents in neighboring countries, and that actually created a lot of problems with the neighbors and distrust with them. So since the end of the Maoist period and when China started to reform and open up itself, it had this, it proposed this good neighbor policy. Okay, essentially China wanted to normalize diplomatic relations with the neighbors, and China also did a lot to settle border disputes. Okay, so actually China so far has settled all of its land border dispute except with one country, that is India. Okay, but still maritime disputes still exist, but largely on land, China sees a much safer border. Okay, and also China tried to expand economic ties with all the neighboring countries, especially in the last since the early 2000s. Okay. After the Asian financial crisis and after China joined WTO, and after the US became too occupied with this war on terror, and China actually saw a golden decade of building strong ties with the Asian neighbors. Okay, and China also quite actively participated in multilateral organizations like ASEAN, and China even constructed its own international organization, that is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Does anyone know this organization?
With Central Asia.
Yes. Okay. Actually, India is also a member state of this Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Okay. So we can see that China actually wants to engage the neighbors, and it also has enhanced security cooperation with the neighboring countries. Like we know that there are a lot of disputes on the South China Sea, right? And it's very easy for China to run into conflict with neighboring countries. Like from the 1970s and 1990s, China went into military conflicts with quite a number of Asian neighbors. But since China joined ASEAN and it signed the treaty to stop this kind of military conflicts, to make sure that all territorial disputes would be handled through peaceful means, through negotiation and diplomatic methods rather than through wars. So in this sense, China wants to maintain a more peaceful and a stable relationship within the region. Okay, so that's what happened since in the past decades. But of course, China has its troubles in the region. I don't think I have time to go into the details, but I just mention them very briefly. So in China's mind, there are some problematic areas. Okay, of course, Japan comes first. So we know that China and Japan had war back in history, and of course, there's reason for many people in the two countries to hate each other. Mm-hmm. But still, what matters more, I guess, is current interest, and territorial disputes. And we can see actually the two countries, they have their claimed border kind of overlap with each other. So like Senkaku Island in China, we call it Diaoyu Dao, is kind of a focal point of contention between the two countries. Okay, both sides claim the island belongs to itself. But actually, the island itself is a very barren island. There is a very small island. There's nothing there. But why do the two countries fight? Security? Psychological. Okay. Perhaps, yes. Resources, exactly. So actually, there's kind of rich oil field here, somewhere here. And of course, you can say this island is important for strategic reasons as well. Okay, and actually the two countries, they had dispute on the exploration of the oil field here. So the two countries, well, oftentimes the two countries, either side actually can do something to stir up the situation. So from time to time, we will see the two countries will have disputes over this area. So that's with Japan and North Korea. Okay, all along, China regarded North Korea as like a little brother. But now the little brother grows up too strong and too naughty, okay? And the nuclear issue is something that is really out of control now. And China really faces a dilemma about how to handle North Korea. All along, actually, China has sustained North Korea. It provides the majority of the energy supply to North Korea and the food supply to North Korea. And China just sort of function like an ATM for North Korea. Okay, whenever North Korea needed resources, needed money, you will see Korean leaders come to China for help. Okay, and actually that's kind of causing some financial burden on China. You know, China is becoming more and more pragmatic, right? This is kind of a losing investment. And on the other hand, China is also losing its leverage over North Korea. In the past, North Korea largely respected, if not followed, China's suggestions. But nowadays, with North Korea's third generation leader, China is really losing control. And actually, I think China really needs to think hard about how to contain the nuclear development on the Korean Peninsula. So the situation in North Korea now is quite dangerous and quite tricky for China to tackle. Okay, and lastly, South China Sea. We know that China essentially claims all of South China Sea to its own territory, and that runs against the interest of many neighboring countries. So that China actually has to find a way to solve the territorial disputes with so many neighboring countries. And actually, in the past, there's kind of a stalemate in the settlement, because on one hand, China prefers bilateral negotiations so that it can divide and conquer the smaller neighboring countries, right? But on the other hand, the ASEAN countries or the neighboring countries, they prefer a multilateral platform to handle the issue. So the two sides actually find it very hard to reach a deal. Okay, so perhaps this is going to be left to future generations of leadership to solve. So far, we don't see too much progress in this regard. Okay, so that's about China, the neighboring countries. But overall, despite these disconcerting factors, we should say China maintains a rather good and mutually beneficial relations with its neighbors. And the last priority, the developing countries. Okay. Since the 1990s, actually China has paid growing attention to the developing countries. And it actually adopts a kind of a multidimensional strategy when dealing with these countries. Okay. Well, first of all, China does have a lot to gain from its interactions with the developing countries for resources, okay, and for market. So economic reason perhaps is the foremost driving force for China to go into the developing countries. And we can see that, for example, in Africa, Chinese investment is everywhere, okay? And wherever there are resources, you can see Chinese investments, okay? But of course, China's investment is not only just for resources, the mineral resources or raw materials. Nowadays, we see more and more Chinese investment in infrastructure, okay? And China is also trying to export more of its products to the developing markets. Okay, so we can see in the future actually there should be a lot of room for economic ties to grow between China and the developing countries. And besides economic ties, political support is another very important reason for China to go into the developing world. We know that when China rejoined the United Nations, it is the votes from the developing countries that help China, okay, to replace Taiwan and for China to rejoin the UN and as a Security Council member. And on many political issues, actually China needed the support from the developing countries. For example, like human rights issues, okay, and later Taiwan issues. Whenever some Western countries want to criticize human rights issues in China, China would mobilize its African brothers to block the bill from being passed in the UN. Okay, so you know that for the many developing countries, they are very small, they are very weak, but still in international organizations, one country, one vote, right? So the number still adds up to be large for China's in China's favor. So China does need the political support from the vast number of developing countries. Okay, and also China is having military cooperation with many developing countries, and actually China is one of the largest contributors of peace-preserving troops, or peacekeeping troops in the UN. Okay, and actually among the 5 permanent Security Council members, China is the largest contributor of peacekeeping troops. And China is now sending peacekeeping troops to a lot of countries and showing its growing participation in the global security system. Okay, and of course China's efforts do pay off oftentimes. Okay, and lastly, China is also making use of its long history and its rich culture to strengthen cultural exchanges with developing countries, like this kind of gala. You can see perhaps on many occasions China holds cultural events and with African brothers or other Asian neighboring countries. So China does promote cultural exchanges in many developing countries, like building the Confucius Institute to try to promote the teaching of Chinese in other countries. So all these are the efforts for China, perhaps to build up its soft power, okay, which we will discuss later in more detail. Okay, so that's China's relationship with developing countries. And okay, China actually has done a lot to build a good relationship with other parts of the world. And it seems that China will rise peacefully, okay, appearing as a good neighbor, as a responsible great power. But will it rise peacefully? Okay, in the end, perhaps we want to look at the prospect of China's peaceful rise. Well, actually, the peaceful rise theory was formally proposed back in early 2000s under Hu Jintao's administration. The main argument of China's peaceful rise theory is that China's priority is still domestic development. Okay, it does not seek to dominate the world, and China's rise actually follows a very different model from the past powers, in the sense that China has so-called 3 transcendencies. Okay, first, there will be new model of industrialization. That is, China, when it rises, it will not seek to colonize other countries to take away their resources as the Western powers did in the history. Okay, and there's going to be a new way for great power to emerge. That is, well, China does not follow the Cold War mentality. It will not develop relations according to ideological doctrines, and it will not seek to get into conflict with other countries. And also China will have new modes of social control. That is, it will not export its domestic problems into other countries. Rather, it wants to achieve the so-called harmonious society and harmonious world. Okay, and essentially, this theory is a gesture to other countries to assure other countries that China only has peaceful intentions. Okay, it does not seek to become the next hegemon in the world. But interestingly, the term was first called a peaceful rise. But since 2005, the use of peaceful rise actually declined significantly. Instead, China used another term, peaceful development. Okay. Does anyone know why? What's the difference between peaceful rise and peaceful development? They still appear the same, right? Okay, yeah, that's a very good way to interpret it. Yes, indeed. When you talk about rise, it has more implications that your rise, like in comparison with others, right?
Many may not like it.
What's that?
Many of the rivals or maybe competitors may not like the word rise.
Right.
Development, because
Exactly.
it's a threat to other countries.
Yeah, and development sounds more harmless, right? Everyone wants development, right? And it's kind of politically more neutral, right? It has more, as you said, economic implications, right? So yeah, as a result, China uses the term peaceful development more in later years. But basically, the idea remains the same. Okay, it argues that China's rise will be of largely peaceful nature. But I guess not everyone buys this argument, right? And indeed, will China continue to rise peacefully? Actually, there are arguments on both sides. Okay, so yes, some people do believe that China can rise peacefully for various reasons. For example, if you believe in liberal IR theory, economic interdependence actually would stop countries from going to war with each other. So nowadays, with China's increasing participation in global trade and economic system, actually people do have reason to believe that China will not risk war because that will ruin its economic development, right? So if you buy this argument, economic globalization actually will bind China's hands and stop it from getting into military conflicts with other countries. And also, participation in international institutions is believed to bind China's hands as well. And because so far, actually, China largely appears to abide by the rules of the game, okay? And when China gets involved in more and more international institutions, it will not try to rot the system, okay, and to change the international or challenge the international system. And the third view is that, well, with China's economic development, China may become politically liberalized. And in the past, actually, many people hold this view. But nowadays, I'm not sure if still we can argue so. Given China's recent trajectory of political development, there's actually very little sign that economic development will make China politically more liberal, at least in the near future. Okay, so I'm not sure if this argument still holds, or maybe someday there will come a juncture point when China is developed enough, it may become politically liberalized, we don't know. Okay, so there's hope, but I'm not sure. Maybe the hope is dimming or something. Okay, in any case, these are the reasons for people to believe that China may rise peacefully. But on the contrary, many other people also argue China will not rise peacefully. Okay, so first of all, there's in IR there's this idea about balance of power. That is, whenever one power rises, other countries will come together to balance against it, often ending in war. If we just think about how the past powers rose, Britain, Germany, U.S., the major powers, they emerge all from war. Why would China be exceptional? So if we learn from history, perhaps there's some reason to believe China will not rise peacefully. And secondly, there's this security dilemma. And given China's non-transparent military expenditure and military build-up, other countries have a lot of reasons to believe or to question China's peaceful intention. Because after all, China's military expenditure is rising, okay? And we don't know how China uses its military expenditure. Unlike other countries, democratic countries, who's more transparent, China rarely discloses its military expenditure. So this is hardly convincing, right, to other countries that you will be peaceful. And the lack of democracy, okay. In IR, there's a theory called democratic peace theory. That is, democracies will not go to war with each other. But democracies often go to war with non-democratic countries, and non-democratic countries also fight against each other. So if China remains authoritarian, there's no institutional guarantee, or say, in theory, that it will not become involved into some military conflicts with other countries. So that's the third reason. And lastly, there's a rising trend of nationalism, which appears quite dangerous to other countries. When Chinese population becomes more nationalistic, and oftentimes they are more, it's not just a defensive nationalism, but rather offensive nationalism. Okay, so that is, on the nationalist Chinese population would support his regime to fight against other countries like Japan, often. Maybe in the name of revenge or something, to redress historical injustice or anything. There may be this kind of dangerous tendency for not only the Chinese government, but also the Chinese population to want war with other countries. So, if that's true, then when China becomes powerful enough to challenge the international system and to attack other countries, would that happen? Could be. But so far, there is no clear answer to whether China can rise peacefully or not. I'll leave it to you guys later to discuss, and perhaps we can discuss this together. Okay.